believe that rustle of my lapel means this mic is live. So, hello everyone. As Joe mentioned, my name is Jerrod Larson. I work at Larson Airlines as a design manager. And my topic, I tried to figure out some really good titles here. I was telling an illustrator here that risk management in design didn't seem super motivating, so Big Bang, managing the Big Bang is actually the title of the talk. But eventually you'll see that my talk is really about kind of at a meta level, how to manage risk on a big scale project. It'll make more sense as I go through the slides. But what I want to do is walk through the slides, give you guys a sense of what I'm talking about, provide some pointers, then open it up for questions and conversations at the very end of the conversation. If I use any terms, however, that are maybe unique to Alaska that nobody else is aware of, raise your hand, let me know, and I'll try to define those. But as far as kind of big questions, there's notepads over there, write them down, and ask them at the tail end of the conversation, or else catch me after the presentation. So I want to start the talk with a bit of a journey. I started Alaska Airlines 14 months ago, almost to the day, as a matter of fact. And this is the website that I inherited. And as a design manager, my first task was picking up a really huge design project to transform this customer experience. And that design project was sort of a kitchen sink of design things. We wanted to make the site accessible for people with visual impairments, motor disabilities, things like that. We wanted to change the information architecture of the site. We wanted to improve its merchandising capabilities, so how we sell things on the website. I should also mention, by the way, an airline's website is essentially an e-commerce system. That's the kind of bottom line. It sells tickets. That's its chief function. It does additional things as well, but we look at this as a storefront, so to speak. It's not static. And then the last thing, we wanted to change the visual identity of the site and our brand to conform to some other changes that were happening at the airport, on other aircraft, things like that. And that last piece, that brand piece, was the most challenging piece of that project, in the sense that we were not able to reveal brand changes prior to deploying this product to customers. So if you think about it, a lot of change happening, and then a massive deployment, a big bang, as it were. And that's a little bit what I'll speak to. By the way, here's what the result was. Several months later, we deployed this website, launched it. And relatively recently, if you're in the Seattle area, maybe on the West Coast corridor, we actually just launched a new version of the website. And this is just one view of it. Of course, we have tablet response and things like that. And all this happened within 14 months, so massive change, not just the homepage, but actually the whole ecosystem was changing. And this last project included a lot of coordination with other channels, airport kiosks, in-flight entertainment systems, as well as mobile devices and a bunch of different products, all kinds of customer touch points. So let me sort of give you my challenge by asking you a question. Let me give a show of hands here. So, of the people in this room, practicing researchers, designers, product managers, who in this room has had the world's best design project or best idea that you've run by customers and had that idea not be very performant, have an issue with your design? Has anybody ever had that experience? Okay, so about half the room. I'm presuming the rest of you are in school and you haven't had the experience of actually deploying something, because the fact of the matter is, we have a user-centered design process primarily because we know that we design something with the best intentions and we get feedback from customers, and invariably there's changes that need to be made eventually. But here you can see the risk and the problem that I was dealing with. With a massive change to something like this, where there are literally dozens of substantial customer experience changes launching on one day of the thing that makes your company essentially money, that's a really hard, risky situation to be in, right? So as a design manager, I have to manage designers and researchers, but I also have to manage the risk to my company, because my executives want to make sure that we make money the day that this launches, and that this might be beautiful, but if it doesn't make money, I'm actually looking for a new job, right? So the problem I had, not just in terms of that risk, but in terms of what the discipline says about my problem, was kind of summarized nicely in this article from Jerrod School 13 years ago. And Jerrod School here reliably says, don't do massive relaunches, right? So that's the advice we all get. Don't do these big scale redesign launches. Just incrementally improve the product, make sure you understand what the customers need, and deploy changes, make iterations, that sort of thing. And that is great, and if you can execute that, by all means do so. But sometimes designers and design managers are given the opportunity, let's say, to do these gigantic launches without any ability to do any pivoting. So you're handed the direction, go launch this on a certain date, and you're provided guidance from our community, don't do those big launches, something has to give. And so I've designed a presentation for you folks to give you the advice I never had as a practitioner. And so I can promise you one thing, you can kind of tell by the quality of the slides here. This is not going to be a big picture design presentation. This is not going to be big ideas. This presentation is not going to be highfalutin. It's not going to be theoretical. I'm going to give you very practical advice about what to do to manage risk on projects like this. And my hope is that at least one or two of these pieces are helpful for you in your day-to-day jobs. And perhaps if you're new to the field, maybe a lot of these ideas might be helpful for you going forward. And so they will be posed as ideas. I was actually going to call these tips, but I realized that sounds too low-falutin. So I call them ideas because that sounds a little bit more germane to this kind of discussion. Without further ado, I've broken them out into kind of a little bit of the design process, so groundwork all the way down to deployment, so you'll get a sense of the entire process, what you do above and beyond doing the day-to-day design work. And so the first idea is, I would be remiss not to mention this, try to avoid doing these big projects like I just mentioned that I did. Or at very least, what you should do is convey the risk of doing something like that to management and provide alternatives to management about what to do differently. So what I mentioned here were big redesign projects consuming multiple months of designers and researchers' time, and then a big launch on a big day, right? And hopefully balloons fall from the ceiling and everybody's cheering and it's all happy. But instead, what I think the discipline advocates is this kind of incremental release of ideating features, improving the feature, redesigning, if you will, on that feature, but small deployments. I think another way to look at it would be something like a big redesign project that then you do small deployments thereafter. And none of this is new to experienced practitioners, but I think what is new in terms of the managing risk perspective is conveying these alternatives to your leadership team, your product managers and everybody else who you work with as risk profiles. So the top profile is the biggest risk, the bottom profile is the least risk, and the medium profile is the medium risk. Instead, I was handed this slot and I executed the top, most risky business without letting my management team know these are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about, the kinds of risks that we're incurring by doing these gigantic redesigns. So the next topic is, again, not really surprising to a lot of experienced people, but what we don't want to do is conflate usability test results and qualitative feedback from customers as the same as A/B testing, and certainly not the same as doing predictions of conversion or predictions of site performance. And it's actually very, very easy to do. Let me give you an example. We did, on one of the projects, we did 100 plus customers in usability testing with labs and so forth, 40 plus hours of research, and every single bit of data we had, both quantitative and qualitative, was positive. There was essentially, by the time we were ready to deploy, there were no signals of any sort of issue whatsoever with our design projects. We followed user-centered design to the greatest extent that we could possibly do given our resources. We deployed our experience, and we saw some pretty drastic drops in conversion rate on the first couple of days. And by the way, we did that by looking not just at existing customers, we looked at brand new customers as well to say, well, maybe they're just a learned behavior. We looked at new customers and the same thing happened, right? So now, the day of deployment, the balloon should be falling, we should be celebrating. Now we're figuring out what's our action plan for rectifying this new issue. So that goes a lot to the next topic, that as design leaders, we should be conveying risks of design to management pretty early. And it seems really natural to say that, but invariably it's something that gets forgotten. I don't know who in this room, let me actually do another show of hands. who feels like design at their company is so well understood that there's no advocacy whatsoever that the design team needs to do? No. So most people seem to be saying, yeah, we need to advocate for our design work quite a lot. The problem becomes when you get into this mode of advocating for your design work, it's really easy to forget the really subtle notion that your design might not be perfect. And so you might get into the mode where you're saying something like, this design's fantastic, we tested with users, and then the message heard at your company is, we're going to make a lot of money on this design, right? But the fact of the matter is, all of us in this room know that there's a little caveat there that says that we might need to do some iteration. So what I recommend is being very careful about advocating for your design work and your team, but also mentioning the need to do something like iterations after release. And that's a perfectly legitimate statement. That's not backing away from the advocacy. What you're doing is educating people about the user-centered design process, letting them know that it's not just, design's not a binary thing. People respond in different ways, and sometimes you need to do iteration. And so if teams are not aware of that, there's a more fundamental problem per se, but it should be worked on. And regardless of how well people perceive your design, you absolutely must need to have a plan B and or plan C, and the list goes on, from a redesign release. And I would advocate, by the way, that plan be based on some sort of performance threshold as opposed to just, subjective input as far as how well things are performing. So maybe your plan B is that you do this gigantic redesign because you're, again, tasked with doing it. It makes sense to look at the performance of that particular release and see how well you're performing, how well your design is performing in the wild. And then make determinations not based on reactionary kind of, oh my gosh, the numbers are dropping drastically, but rather have a very objective, very cause and effect way to look at the data to say, okay, we've passed through our low performance threshold, therefore we're going to go into plan B. And plan B should be articulated as if you knew it was going to happen all along, right? So plan A, fast and success. Plan B is either roll back one or several changes and then revisit the design, or maybe it's you've already trained your team to say, okay, with this level of performance, we're still willing to roll out the change and keep it, but we're going to start going into an iteration mode. That's a reasonable plan B. Not having a plan B, though, is really not appropriate if you're working in a large-scale company. So I left off the practice of design, pushing pixels as it were, because I think there's a lot of different sessions in this, this conference that speak about those. But let me say what worked for my team, particularly in the last project where we had an omni-channel experience that we're designing for. We had a web team with a different reporting structure, a mobile team with a different reporting structure, a kiosk team with a different reporting structure. As a design leader and as a designer, you need to break down those organizational barriers when you do this big kind of omni-channel design experience. And so what worked for us is a daily collaboration with the core designers and researchers across function, as well as weekly executive reviews. The idea being everybody was on the same page, literally and figuratively, and then the company executive leadership team was always aware of what we're working on because we did a checkout every Friday. And not everybody wanted to attend a Friday afternoon checkout session, particularly on really nice, beautiful summer days, but it was really helpful for us to convey, again, those risks as well as here's what we're doing from a design perspective as we went through the process. So now let's say that you've been through that process and now you're getting ready to launch a product, or products as it were. One thing that we started doing, we didn't get the okay to deploy major brand changes to customers prior to our big launch. But what we were able to do is start covertly testing parts of the experience that we thought were not going to sort of tip our hand and let people know that we are doing this massive rebranding at Alaska Airlines. Really in the know, customers might be able to perceive that there's something going on deeper than just a subtle design change. But it was really helpful for us to get data to help us understand whether or not we're making progress or not. So on our website, when you shop for a flight, you see a big matrix full of available flights with prices associated with each flight. Left side is what we had in production prior to our kind of big brand release. And on the right side, it's hard to tell with the monitor. Believe me, it's better contrast than that. What we have on the right side is a simplified version. Because that's kind of the bread and butter of where our e-commerce system operates, like finding flights and finding prices, we didn't want to leave that to chance. So we ripped out all the other brand elements that we were trying to achieve, like the gigantic header with the new logo and all that stuff. We just injected this experience into an A/B test for a couple of weeks to understand, did we break the store with our design work? It turns out we didn't break the store, which is why on the right side, we rolled that out into the entire launch package. Another thing for managers in particular to kind of keep in mind is, it's something that's easy to forget, but when you do a large-scale redesign and launch of that redesign project, you need to make very well sure that you have enough resources to actually cover any things that happen once you release that package. So we had designers and developers and researchers actually basically on call from the day that it launched for a couple of weeks thereafter. This is sort of the product support model that I was looking at. But here you can see the support to launch. Almost everybody, I think typically the way you look at a launch is the day the launch happens, designers celebrate. You go happy hour and just have a good time, right? The way I look at it is the day that the thing launches is the day that you start either being successful or not successful. And then not successful means everybody needs to be on deck working on that problem. And so what I like to do is reserve capacity, pretty significant capacity in my teams for that moment that the light switch flips on and that we have designers and researchers then ready to able to solve those problems. By the way, we mentioned designers, researchers, and developers, but we also had analytics people who were looking at the data, helping us understand what was happening, so on and so forth. So on that launch day, I also appointed a monitor, somebody who was going to go through and methodically record what customers were saying about the new experience, what our web analyst was telling us about the conversion rate and site performance, looking at social media, looking at feedback that we received through the traditional feedback channels, talking to the call centers, that sort of thing. All that data was collected every single day after the launch to understand what are people saying, both qualitatively as well as are they buying tickets. And we review that at daily stand-up. So here is a really cheap version of that stand-up. We just review the feedback to understand, are we tracking, are we not tracking, are there any things that crop up that were surprising? In fact, that iPad user statement was a true statement. We actually had an issue with some of our tablet experiences at our first launch, and we found that out through some web analytics as well as some feedback that we're getting on Twitter. And we wouldn't have known that had we not done those standard stand-ups every single morning to understand what's happening. And I'll talk about what we did as a result of that as a later idea. The other thing that we did really successfully is on the day of the launch, literally the moment, or not literally the moment, but the hour that we did the launch, we actually started running unmonitored usability testing that hour. And what that means, if you've never done it before, is we set up something through a product called UserTesting, so that we created a script for people to use and walk through the experience. And it creates videos, essentially, of customers interacting with your product in the wild. So they're on their own computers, they're anywhere in the country, or maybe even in Canada or Mexico, and they're just giving feedback about your experience. I think it's like $100 per session, and so for us, it's $2,000 or $3,000 really well spent. And what that helped us understand was we actually picked up some QA issues, some browsers that were really not on our radar from a QA perspective, but also some user experience things that we weren't expecting. People reacting to photos we selected that we didn't expect to have happen. What I think is interesting here is that we looked at the launch as essentially almost like a research mode. So we did research up front, and then at launch we did our own bona fide research effort to look at unmoderated testing, to look at A/B tests, to look at feedback from Twitter and that sort of thing. So I think it's sort of pushing the research process across the entire ecosystem and across the entire project until you feel really satisfied with your results. And then maybe the last big idea is if you have a bad result at the launch, definitely don't panic. It happens to all of us. I think that definitely happened with us. We see the site that we have in production today because we were ultimately successful. I can tell you, again, to be totally candid, launch days were not successful. We had to work on those things, and so I don't think a lot of designers talk about things that weren't successful, but we did have some non-successes in our back pocket. But one of the keys is that we primed leadership on the need to do iterations after launch. And so going back to a couple of earlier slides, if you don't convey the need to iterate after launch, this iteration piece is going to come as a wild surprise to people who are expecting, all things to be perfect and rosy. So the way we looked at it, by the way, when we got poor results, is we started diving in after those stand-up meetings. We started diving in to understand where the issues might be. Are they across the entire ecosystem with all customers? Were they unique to individual platforms? Were people complaining in different parts of the world? We looked at all that stuff. We started, designers and product managers hypothesized what could be going on. We started doing some analysis too to understand, how well the browsers perform, things like that. And then designers did interventions to understand, okay, can we fix this? Maybe some developers did interventions too to fix some things that were happening on the back end. And then we reevaluated after we did a deployment, after we did some intervention. So this is, again, not a big shocker. This is actually the user-centered design process. The difference is we are doing it in context of an issue with the website in production at that moment. And this entire process is maybe articulated up until the intervention piece in an hour. Like just a really quick session, we're looking at data, understanding it. Designers are mocking up solutions, and then we're talking to developers, how quickly can we get this out so we can see what's happening, and then we move forward from there. So with that, I promised you very pragmatic tips on what to do to sort of manage these big projects at the highest level. And what I'd like to do now is just open up the conversation for questions or for feedback you might have. Way back there?
Is there any lessons that you can share in terms of like with the conversion and why you were experiencing, and anything from a qual perspective that you might have not tested that you wish you had tested?
Yeah, so the question was, were there any lessons about those dips and conversions, things that we picked up? I think I wish I could say that there was a really kind of big overarching thing that would apply to all use cases. But I think in most cases, design is so particular to the problem you're trying to solve that our issues were unique to the challenges customers shopping for tickets online would have, issues again with browser incompatibilities with some of the stuff we're doing with regard to design. As well, people's reaction to really subjective things like photography. Some of that took us by surprise. Some of it was actionable, some of it was just like good to know. But the fact of the matter is when you can have a site like this and you change the hue of a button and you have significant performance changes, and you take that hue and then you add it to responsive design, accessible design, new merchandising layout, new information architecture, the challenge is having your analytics team really be able to dive into those various things really deeply to understand enough so that you can hypothesize. So I don't have any sort of grand statements about things that we discovered, but I can tell you everything from the super subjective to the this is broken was part of the mix, and we had to then prioritize within that to say what should we fix next. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about how you spoke with your leadership about the expectations, like how to set the expectations that you might not succeed the first time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question was sort of what I did to manage my leadership with Upward about the need to iterate and that sort of thing. At the start, let me say that I'm not an expert in it. In fact, I didn't do that very well, which is part of the reason why this came together is I wanted to give other people some perspective on the need to do it. What I found, people particularly not in management roles at the leadership level, the way I've been using the word risk here makes a lot more sense to them than the way I was speaking to them prior. So my prior discussion was, I think this will work really well from a design perspective, I think that won't work very well. And I think their world of sort of processing that was subjective. Like, yeah, I like things too, and I don't like some things too, right? When I started using phrases like risk and dips in conversion and things like that, any manager worth her salt will be able to understand what that means. And so it's kind of the Rosetta Stone between design and management, does that make sense? So I was using those kinds of phrases later on in the project that I could tell immediately they understood what I was conveying. Other questions? Yes?
So when doing the redesign in small launches, where would you suggest starting? The homepage of the high traffic page or the templates you're looking at for that?
Yeah, so the question was, where would you start if you're doing sort of incremental releases to fix an experience or that sort of thing? Again, that's a bit contextual. We had a bit of a challenge because as a design function, we believe the entire thing works as one gigantic ecosystem, and therefore, digesting one particular page and then fixing that page and then doing the next page wouldn't create a very good customer experience. So what I would recommend is sort of a lateral approach, like figuring out a workflow that kind of transcends various touch points and figuring out how to make that better within that particular workflow. Because one thing we observed as part of this project was that customers did not look at, obviously, the home page is different than the search results page is different than the checkout page. And they all looked at it as one gigantic thing. But when we changed buttons across those pages, they could process that more carefully. So I look at it not as a particular page or whatever. I look at it as a feature that kind of transcends those pages, if you will. But again, it's somewhat contextual to your problem statement, but that's what we would do next time if we have the chance. Other questions?
So I was excited to hear that you A/B tested elements kind of on the live site before launching. Did you roll back to the previous experience? So is this kind of out there and then be done, or did you leave some?
Right. Yeah, so the question was, when we did our A/B test, our covert A/B test of some of the experience, did we roll it back to the old experience after we got our performance data? The fact of the matter is we did roll back to the old experience. And again, part of it was because the big bang launch was going to be, I think impact was kind of the operative word, like how to make this really, really impactful, again, without breaking the system. So we did a bunch of tests that we rolled back to our existing experience and then rolled it all into one and then deployed that change. Question over there?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I saw that, I just checked the site on mobile phone and website. So the experience is quite different from the desktop experience. I was wondering if there was a push from management or from the engineers to make everything responsive, including the mobile phone version. And how did you manage those expectations, if they were?
Yeah, so the question is, with regard to Alaska Air, we have a website, we also have an M site, and there's some differences in the experience, not just from a visual perspective, but some interaction differences. I think, without getting too far into the politics of design, let me mention that there's some politics with design. So what we chose to do is maintain our website experience to some extent, but then build sort of a responsive down to handheld version of the homepage without really making it accessible to customers, so you'd have to kind of work to get to the handheld version of the website. But that's not happening in a vacuum, and I think I mentioned at the start of the talk that there are specific there's a mobile team, there's a web team, and a kiosk team. Their reporting structures are not the same. And so there's some difficulties there in sort of reconciling those worlds, and we're working through those today. Other questions?
Is there anything unique you did to cater to users coming from like Orbitz, Kayak, and Kerr, and were you able to sort of get a portion of them to cut out those sites?
Yeah, so the question is our relationship to third parties like Orbitz, Expedia, so on and so forth. That is something that we care about. It wasn't part of this redesign project. One of the things that, naming matters a lot, and maybe the name of Big Bang wasn't the best name for this presentation, but naming kind of sets people's expectations up. So these projects were framed as brand changes. And of course, designers who hear things like responsive design or accessible design or changing information architecture, invariably you're not thinking brand changes. So I think they were sort of staged as brand changes, that we did a lot more than just brand changes. But that's something we care about. We didn't factor that in so much into this project, but it's something we do work on elsewhere.
So since you mentioned the visual aspects of the brand stuff, but it's supposed to be across all these different areas, do you measure, beyond conversion, some of those things to kind of get a feel for how well those work?
Excuse me. Yes, we do. I promise that had nothing to do with your question. My ability to swallow. So yes, we did. There's like this whole sort of focus group model in the brand team. All right, let me walk through to kind of understand how well we're tracking in that regard. I had to end this conversation early. Actually, I'm getting the mic off just for a second so I can get a good hearty cough. Anyway, so I think one of the factors at play is when you're dealing with a company, I say dealing in a positive sense, but a company with a digital channel as well as a physical channel, brand is a bit of a challenge. And I don't mean it's an opportunity. I guess to wear my manager hat, it's a bit of an opportunity in the sense that it's easy to define brand for what looks really beautiful on the airplane, what looks good inside a physical store. It's a little bit, thank you so much. Actually, this was the cause of the issue. It was. But what we need to do is kind of translate standards that were developed a bit outside of the digital realm into our space. And so what we did, if you look at some of the really, really careful details, they were modified slightly based on what worked for our channel. And so we did, as part of the A/B testing, the covert A/B testing, we test our call to action colors, things like that. So we did a lot of that color study and that kind of, those kind of studies in a much more controlled fashion. But yes, we did subjective kind of focus group testing on experience things and people identifying words they associate with this color or that brand promise, things like that. And of course the design challenge, which isn't in this deck, is really organizing that into a final design project. But we were driven by equal parts quantitative data as well as qualitative data. Are you back there?
So you mentioned earlier that you ran like hundreds of tests, a falling plot, and they all came back with positive feedback, but then the results were negative conversion rates. Did you go back to your data and see where it had steered you wrong?
We honestly, we probably didn't do as, so the question was, you know, the 100+ people we ran through studies, all the data telling us prior to our launch that things were good, and then eventually the launch not being so good. Like, how do you reconcile those two worlds where, you know, research was telling you things were good and then the final product was that's bad? Say bad, it's probably an overstatement. We didn't do a robust analysis. We did do a debrief where we kind of walked through what happened and what, you know, we documented all the issues, surprises we had, and talked about what we could do to reduce those surprises in the future. We didn't find a very good connection. I think the only connection I would have is that they are very different methods, and they were used for different purposes. And so, what I think to be self-critical, I think the most important thing that we did was we inadvertently conflated the two ideas. So I don't think there was any issue with our usability testing. I think our usability testing was perfectly legitimate. It helped us in a lot of ways. It was mostly positive. It wasn't always positive. We did iterations based on the feedback. But I think what we did is we ended up building a false sense of hope for ourselves as well as our leadership team. And I think that's the critical thing, is saying not that there's some deep flaws in usability testing. In fact, where we ended up was as a result of usability testing, and I think it would help us a great deal in user research more generally. But we just need to be cautious not to conflate the two things together. We need to be very careful to say different methods for different parts of the process, and they all have different purposes. And A/B testing is very different than usability testing.
So did you take into consideration the implementation dip that sort of anything you change the design, it seems to drop just because it's different?
So the question is, did we take into account the implementation dip? So there is definitely a human nature when you launch a big change, you know, things like conversion do tend to dip. The way we accounted for that was looking and controlling for brand new customers. So we're able to look at conversion rate for everybody, but also we then pulled off people who've never been to the site before. And then if we saw a dip in that sense, we could say that there was something deeper than just people, like change, right? It was deeper than change.
Could you speak to between your department and the marketing department, how those responsibilities and those conversations took place?
Yeah, sure. So they are two different departments. Marketing is a peer organization to the e-commerce team, which this work I mentioned here represents. And marketing's function at Alaska is, you know, multifaceted, of course, as each department is. But they do things like set brand direction at the highest level, so they're worried about brand expression across airplane liveries as well as airports. They're responsible for overall customer experience, if you will, at an airline. And then our job is to take those standards and figure out how they work in our digital space to improve customers' experience online. And so the way in which they interacted with this project was they were setting kind of overall brand direction, brand guidance. And then in that process, I mentioned the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday slide. They were part of the Friday report outs. So our team was primarily designers there. We also had stakeholders from marketing, e-commerce, and other places to provide feedback and get insight. Like, are we expressing the brand in the way that they'd like us to? And then we provide feedback about what seems to be working well from an A/B testing perspective, conversion perspective. So we integrated the teams by virtue of our process. But we are organization with sticks. Other questions?
So you talked about there being a diff and there's lots of lessons learned, but is there a happy ending? Was it
Yeah, absolutely,
like
yeah.
triple conversion 2 months afterwards? Like, where did it net out?
So I can't reveal the data, but I can say that the data was eventually positive. Not just positive, but we had performance measures, as I mentioned before, and we did meet those performance measures overall. So yeah, it's actually a good news story. People who've worked with me know that I tend to be a glass half empty person. But in fact, it was a good story. And the fact that we did 2 relatively large-scale designs, redesigns in 14 months, and our customers are still respecting us and still purchasing tickets and still flying with us is a good sign. So we've actually, I think, managed that pretty well. And the result is it was pretty successful.
So you talked a lot about managing leadership expectations. When it came to like experiencing results that you didn't expect, how did you kind of manage the team's morale and like keep them kind of eager or helping to solve the kind of problems that were identified early?
Yeah, so the question was, how did I sort of work through morale of the team that worked with me once the sort of the release happened, we needed to make some changes. The way I approached it was, again, not emotionally. I sort of looked at it as, okay, this is this data, let's talk about how to work on the problem together. So my approach was just to break down the problem, have them in the room to help me fix and sort of ideate on what we can do differently. And so I was essentially just the facilitator for their great work, right? So I didn't perceive any particular morale dip, but they were, I think the thing about designers and researchers is they're more familiar with the idea that things don't go the way you expect them to go than everybody above them, right? So they were pretty used to the idea. I think for them, it was me shielding them from what was a bit of a drama above. And then just saying, just practically, here's the data we're looking at, what can we do to fix it, and just treat it like any other design project. So for their perspective, it was just like any other design project, I presume. It'd be interesting if one of them were up here and tell me. I mean, I'm sure there were some stressful moments, to say the least, but I think we might be close to time. But any other questions? Last question, perhaps?
Yes, I have a question about the two redesigns and how they related to each other. Did you know about the second one when you're doing the first one, launching that one, or was it kind of you just reacted to the first one?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line question is why 2 redesigns in 14 months? It's a good question, actually. So I was totally unaware of the need to do a second redesign. And the second redesign, frankly, if I go way back as I talk, the first redesign was basically just getting the design house in order on the website. So the website was just kind of wildly out of date. It wasn't working for certain types of customers. Its way of selling was pretty antiquated. Its information architecture was pretty broken. So the first launch, and I apologize for these slide flipping, the first launch was really a focus on just moving us beyond this. And it was a lot of structure to just improve the customer experience overall. So this is the intermediate step. And then the final step was a new direction from the marketing department saying we're going to rebrand their entire airline. In that case, this change was primarily on the visual side. We did make some accessibility improvements. We did some other things to kind of clean up the shop, so to speak. But the first one was a little bit more significant. The second one was a little bit more to support the brand. But I was unaware of the need to do a second one until you were in it. As is oftentimes the case, I suspect. All right, well, thank you all so much for your time.